Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul, and I have a quick video for you guys today about an update to our Stormcast Eternals tier list. When the Battlescroll launched last month, we didn't think that there would be an update to the tier list because it didn't seem like anything had changed significantly. There were very minor point changes for Stormcast, things like 20 points off Taurus, 30 points off Bastion. These things seemed really important, and then we did some list building, and they weren't actually that important after all. However, there has been some significant changes in the meta. Flesh Eater Courts, Caradron, Cruel Boys, Daughters of Cain were all nerfed. All of them are still a threat, however, but they are testing different lists than what they were doing before the Battlescroll. Lumineth and Cities of Sigmar were nerfed significantly and no longer pose as much of a threat as they used to. And now we see the rise of DPS check armies like Ironjaws that are spamming, tons of Ard Boys that have 3-up saves and 5-up wards, and we just need to be able to do huge amounts of damage in order to deal with them. There's also been some recent innovations in Stormcast list building as we have gone through the season dealing with obscuring and the meta and all of our new tools. One of the new things we've picked up on is recycling reinforced long strikes. We've talked about recycling a lot on this channel. If you're not familiar, I'll put a link to the recycling video up on screen right now for you. Another thing that we've been looking into is using Karazai as a cavalry unit. Now, obviously, he doesn't have the cavalry keyword, but what we mean by this is using him as a replacement unit for a reinforced cavalry unit in what we call a double cavalry or double cav style, where you have these two units that are playing one side of the board each when they have the power to collapse into the middle of the board. Karazai has actually shown himself to be pretty competent at this role. When you ditch the Praetors and you ditch the Envoy of the Heavens, and you ditch all these defensive bonuses and just use him as a 460-point beatstick, he actually ends up being pretty useful in this role. Another thing we've been experimenting with is maybe we don't need a wizard. Maybe we just don't. Thinking about how many armies there are that you want to unbind and how restrictive spells have become and how lackluster they've become for the most part, it becomes very difficult to justify bringing a 120 or 140-point wizard when you include the cost of the spell lore. 90-point Liberators are also on our radar. I don't think we have manifested any powerful lists with them yet, but they do seem to be an interesting option. It may be interesting enough that we even start running things like Scouting Force instead of having to rely on the final part of Restless Paths where you have to control every single objective, or Restless Energy. And the last insight we've gleaned over the last few months is that obscuring is not the deal breaker we thought it would be. Part of that is that the armies that are in vogue right now are changing. Previously, armies like Cruel Boys, Daughters, Lumineth, and Cities were dominating the game, and they were all able to use obscuring very well. But now we have armies like Flesh Eater Courts and Caradron that have a lot of monsters or flying units, and they can just be shot like normal units. So obscuring is not necessarily a deal breaker, so we think moving forward with the shootcast list could be a viable option. So with all that out of the way, here is our tier list for October 2025. If you're new to the channel, S tier units are something that we feel like you have to put this in your list in order for it to be a competitive list. Like, you're making your list worse by not having this unit in there. And the only two units we consider to be S tier for Stormcast are the Night Relictor and the Stormreach Portal. The Night Relictor is a fantastic priest keyword that also happens to have the most important ability in our army, which is to reduce enemy ward rolls by 1. This ability can get through obscuring. It is extremely powerful. It does rely on a 2+ roll, which you guys know I'm not a fan of, but a 2+ is reliable enough that you can make a plan around it. And if it doesn't happen, well, you could just bring another Night Relictor and try again. There's no limit on how many times you can use this ability. So the Night Relictor is absolutely essential if you want to play Stormcast competitively. A-tier units are units that are very powerful. Some of them might be on the cusp of being in the S tier, but for one reason or another, they just can't be spammable, or maybe they're just not necessary. S tier units are definitely something you have to have. A-tier units will be the majority of the units in your army. Your army will be mostly made up of A and B tier units, some C tier units, D and F, not likely. In the A tier, we've got Quester Soulsworn. They're very efficient. They have a built-in teleport, and they're just a good pile of stats, really. They do the same damage output as Annihilators, which cost 260 points for 6 models. They do the same damage that Prosecutors do on the charge, except they don't have to charge, and they're 100 points cheaper compared to Reinforced Prosecutors. Quester Soulsworn are just all around the most efficient unit in our army, and the more of him you cram into your list, the better it seems to get. However, they do have this anti-spam mechanic built into them because they are so slow, they don't have any charge bonuses, and they're only Rend 1. I think that keeps them from being in the S tier. I think, once you pass 2 Questers in a list, that's probably too many, but it feels really good to add the first one and the second one into your list. Prosecutors are an all-star unit for Stormcast. They have the ridiculous threat range that we need in order to play safely with the rest of our army. A lot of armies need to move into the middle of the board in order to threaten the opponent. You have to get within that 18-inch shooting range, or you have to get into a viable charge range. Prosecutors don't have to worry about any of that because they just teleport wherever they need to with the Stormreach portal, and then they get a 3d6 charge and they get to do something. And just that utility alone is enough to give them the A-tier ranking. They are such a useful strategic unit. Their stats are not great. For 300 points, the damage is not that great. They only have Rend 1, which can be buffed to Rend 2 with a prayer from Iriden, but Iriden is another 320 points on top of that. So Prosecutors are not efficient in terms of health or damage, but they are very, very useful strategically. The only S-tier cavalry in Stormcast that we feel right now is the Vanguard Paladors with Javelins. If you played the Index Hammer last year, you know exactly how good Javelin Paladors are. We thought that obscuring would slow them down, and it has to a degree, but they are rising in stocks, let's say, as the season continues on, and we find more and more targets for them not hidden by obscuring. So they are still an excellent unit. Potentially 20-inch move, followed by shooting, followed by charging, followed by shooting, followed by melee. It is an excellent unit. It does require some build around. You do need something like Vigilors or Aether Wings in your list, and so that does make them more expensive, and they're already expensive to begin with, so they're certainly not a spam unit, although David may disagree with that. He's still trying to make 2x6 work. In terms of shooting, Vigilors are an excellent unit. They're kind of a shooting unit, but they're not really. They're more like a screen unit that happens to have a shooting attack. Their damage output is not good per point, but they are 5 models on a 3+ save, and they can give the rest of your army +1 hit if you build the rest of your army correctly. So they're a very, very useful unit. That +1 hit sometimes is what you need in order to hit on 2s, and sometimes it's what you need to stack with all-out attack in order to get through a -1 hits debuff. Tempestors are rising up in the ranks. They're going up a tier compared to last time we did a tier list update, because I think when we did the last tier list, I said Tempestors are an A-tier unit, but we're putting them in B-tier because they're hard to use. It's not obvious what they should be doing when you put them in your list. Like it's always matchup dependent, battle plan dependent, positioning dependent. Like there's all these different variables that factor into what your Tempestors will be doing for you. But I'm just going to move them into the A-tier now. They are an A-tier unit. They do feel very good at their role. They punch like Questers. They shoot kind of like long strikes, but there's downsides and upsides. They have more health, more speed. They have a good Heaven Sent. They have a good covering fire. They're just all around a great unit. And now that our hero options for bringing them have become cheaper with things like Tornus and Bastion going down in points, it's easier than ever to put Tempestors into your list. Longstrike Raptors and Night Judicators are almost the same unit. Night Judicators have the advantage of giving you more drops. If you value more drops, some players don't. I personally do. I like having 5 drops in every list, so I like Night Judicators a lot. But if you are favoring fewer drops, you can go Longstrike Raptors. You can have a reinforced unit, and they have a very good covering fire. They have very good value for Heaven Sent. They have very good value for Beacon Translocate. They're just an excellent unit, and one of the units definitely to keep an eye on in our next Gladiatorium list building video. The only A-tier heroes that we have are Iriden, the Scourge of Ghyran version, because they have an excellent prayer that goes on Prosecutors. They have good stats for a flanking unit, fast, punchy, a disruptive rampage ability that can put them in places where you wouldn't expect. Really good hero, starting to feel overpriced compared to things like Tornus, who's only 150 points, who can take all units. Starting to wonder how much is that Rend 2 on Prosecutors really worth? There's other ways to get it. You could debuff enemies with Krondys, or you could debuff enemies to prevent all-out defense with Tempestors, for example. It's not the only way to boost your Rend. But Iriden still lays in the A tier. Tornus has risen up 2 tiers from the C tier. We said last time that 170 was still that awkward range where 20 points compared to another hero wasn't really enough to make a difference. But now at 150 points, Tornus is cheap enough that he is become the new Astrea. Astrea Soulbright from the indexes before the Legends revamp was just the hero you started every list with, pretty much, because she could take every single Stormcast unit, and she was a wizard. And Tornus isn't a wizard, but he's also 70 points cheaper. And that 70 points goes a long, long way. So sometimes Tornus is just there as a hero tax. He's a unit you send off to the flank to score objectives, and you don't really care what he does. Other times, he actually has some synergy with prosecutors and reclusians. You can translocate them out of combat and then rally them immediately. It's an expensive command point sync, but it can win you the game because you can translocate into a rally and then place the model closer to the enemy unit and then charge. So, really good combo. Tornus is an excellent unit. I mean, he's not. Unless you're using Rhodation units, he's got like the worst War Scroll ever, but he's become so cheap that he's a useful unit now. For the sake of keeping this video short, I'm not going to go over every B tier unit. I will just talk about all the units that have changed their tiers. Liberators have gone up from C tier to B tier because they are now 90 points. They are, aside from Aether Wings, Liberators are now the cheapest unit in our book, and they're a 3+ save, and they have crit mortals, and they're 10 health on a 3-up save. They've just become efficient. Their ability does basically nothing. They are just a cheap stat block that you can throw in the way of your opponent. And sometimes we might even be dropping unit of Quest or Soulsworn in order to bring 2 units of Liberators, just so we have more coverage over the board, just so we have 2 layers of screens instead of 1 layer of screens that we can throw away against an enemy. Sometimes that extra screen is all you need in order to survive against an aggressive double turn from an enemy. Liberators are, they've turned into a good unit. Stormdrake Guard, with all the changes that have happened in this battle scroll, especially with us recycling on long strikes now, it's very difficult to find room for a list with Stormdrake Guard. I think they're still an excellent unit, but you have to build the whole list around them. And if you're not very well practiced with Stormdrake Guard and they take a charge from an enemy early on in the game, before you've gotten enough value out of them, then the game ends very, very quickly. So they're a high risk, high reward playstyle, and I honestly can't recommend it for most players unless you really love Stormdrakes and you really love making them work. There are better options, but I can't deny their power. They are still definitely at least a B tier unit. They're just too strong to ever be in C tier. Knight Arcanum has fallen out of favor. It's not that other wizards are better. It's just that wizards in general don't seem necessary anymore like they used to. Last season, let's say in the Index Hammer version of the game, we needed a wizard. Spells were so strong, and we had Krondus, who was an excellent wizard, and we had the Knight Arcanum, who was an excellent cheap option. Now the Knight Arcanum kind of feels unnecessary. If all you're casting offensively is the Horrorghast, you're not really getting 140 points worth of value. Defensively, it's still great to cast the Forbidden Power Bridge to get Tempestors out of combat or Prosecutors out of combat, but the use case is a lot more limited. I would not bring Knight Arcanum to just every list like I used to. I would, however, consider running Lord Veritant alongside the Knight Relictor in a double priest setup. There's a lot of lists that can benefit from having, constantly charging up ritual points with one priest while using Beacon Translocate with the other. Lord Veritant also has the -1 cast chant, which could be very useful if you're facing something like Croak. If that's very popular in your meta, you could give Lord Veritant the Intense Piety heroic trait, and then potentially Croak is now -2 casting, which just negates his bonuses, but I mean, that's still very good. Shutting down Croak casting for basically nothing while also generating ritual points is a very good War Scroll. So Lord Veritant is coming in handy here. Bastion is finally at a reasonable point value at 220. His deployment phase ability is situationally strong if you have the exact right list for it. Otherwise, he is just there as a free command point every phase. Well, every phase that you can use all-out attack in. But with Tempestors being so popular and Stormdrakes being so strong, Bastion is a good way to buff those units. They want to use all-out attack. They don't want to rely on Vigilors because much of their damage comes from the companion weapons, and Vigilors don't buff companions. Karazai, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is seeing more use as a pseudo-cavalry unit, because if you compare him to something like Reinforced Concussors, they're both 20 health. Karazai doesn't lose damage as he takes damage. He actually gains more attacks as he takes damage. And he takes healing very well, so you can bring something like a Knight Arcanum with Primal Energy to give him a Life Swarm, and you could rally him, and you can use a Vexillor Banner if you have one in your list for another reason. So Karazai is looking better. We're raising him from C tier to B tier. Lord Celestinate Stardrake, with all the new changes, all the heroes that can take all units becoming more popular, like Karazai, Bastion, Tornus, we're finding less room for the Lord Celestinate Stardrake in lists. It is unfortunate, but 480 points for his damage output is not great, and there's a lot more targets in the game right now, like monsters, that just don't take any damage from his jaws, so it's tougher and tougher to make the Stardrake work. Stormstrike Chariot is finally competitive viable at 120 points. It is a reasonable price point for a unit for what it does. Sometimes it'll do 3d3 mortal wounds because you don't have anything else to use power through on. Sometimes it's just a 10 health single model that blocks a bunch of space and prevents your opponent from moving into that space for a while. It's not great, but it can find its way into competitive lists. At 120 points, it is finally viable. Ionis Cryptborn, we're raising up a tier because there has been some success with him last season. Personally, we didn't think it was the best way to go, but he's gotten a 20-point drop, and that is just enough to start tinkering with him in some lists. I wish he went down another 20 or even 30 points, but 380 is a good starting point. So let's start doing some Ionis tinkering. The Lord Relictor is a strange unit in our army because they're a priest, but instead of being a priest 2, like in a lot of other armies like Fire Slayers, they get a priest 2. There's a few other armies that have units like this. They have Wizard 2 or Priest 2 at a reasonable price point. Lord Relictor just has +1 to chant, and that's it. No signature prayer. Just that's all they do. And it's disappointing because the use case for having a +1 to chant become useful is pretty low, right? It's something like you're running a Knight Relictor and you bring the Lord Relictor along because you want him banking points for blessed weapons to make it more reliable so that you can send out a wave of prosecutors with +1 attack, or like you have Reclusians or Grandhammers or something in the same list. And his use case is just becoming thinner and thinner as units like Ionis and Lord Veritant become useful. His ability to bring prosecutors in his regiment almost doesn't matter anymore because we have things like Tornus at 150 points and Bastion at 220. So units that can bring extra chambers into their regiment are just not very useful anymore. C tier is our competitive cutoff. We think units in the D tier are no longer viable in a competitive setting. Maybe you have to work really hard for them. Maybe they're just too expensive. Maybe they just don't have enough impact. But I'm just going to go over the changes to some of these units that have fallen out of the other tiers. Gryph-hounds were in C tier because they were a 90-point unit that could move reasonably fast. Now with the Liberators at 90 points, there's almost no argument left for them. Just drop Liberators out of reserve. There's no reason to rely on paper-thin Gryph-hounds. Their Warning Cry ability doesn't do anything. I think Celestin Prime is overpriced. 270 is too much, especially now that we have 150-point Tornus. That is such a cheap way to bring all Stormcast chambers that Celestin Prime's niche is he's 120 points more than Tornus, and you can do a lot with 120 points in a Stormcast list. So I don't think he's going to see a lot of play. Knight Draconis had situational use, as sometimes you would bring him when you take Stormdrake Guard, but that use is just not here right now. He is too expensive at 230, and his ability can fail, and his stats are not very impressive, and his regiment is really awful. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done for Knight Draconis to get better. Maybe if we go back into a spell meta at some point, he could become useful because then Stormdrace could have a 4-up spell ignore, but right now it's just not happening. Bandus had a very brief window to shine for the last few months where he could bring Extremist Chamber units, but like I was saying with the Lord Relictor, that niche just doesn't really matter anymore because if you want to bring multi-chamber lists, we have things like Tornus and Bastion at very reasonable price points. And that'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you think I got something wrong, if you think we got something wrong with our tier list, if you think there's a unit that we overvalued or undervalued, please feel free to leave a comment down below. We are not the authority on Stormcast Eternals. We do not want an orthodoxy. If you have an opinion that differs from ours, we want to hear it. We love to argue about this stuff because in arguing about it, we find out that we were insufficient in some way and that our analysis is lacking. And that's exciting for us. We like to be wrong because that means there's more for us to learn. So if you think we're wrong or you think we're right and we're doing a great job, either way, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you want to talk with us all day, every day, then come join us on the Stormkeep Discord server. It's my favorite place to talk about Warhammer. And do all the usual stuff like subscribe, all that crap. So thanks everybody for watching. Look forward to a new list building video in the near future, and we'll see you in the next one.